Well, we are back to the DaniPod. Today, we have with us Dr. Benny Peiser. He's the director of the Global Warming Policy Foundation and a social anthropologist. GWPF is the world's leading think tank that works exclusively on the highly contentious issue of climate change and energy policies. Before directing the GWPF, Dr. Peiser worked as a senior lecturer at Liverpool John Moore University. How are you, Dr. Peiser?
I'm very well. Thank you for inviting me, and I'm happy to talk to you today.
Thank you very much for joining us. Today, I want to talk to you about global warming and the policies related to that, and the impacts on Brazil in special. But let's take a step back and talk about global warming. Well, we had in the 60s, we were told that the planet had too much people and that hundreds of millions would starve to death. In the 70s, the global cooling and the new ice age would come. In the 80s, the ozone layer, the new ice age would come also. And we were running out of oil and gas and the acid rain. These scares came and go. But the global warming or climate change has lasted. Why that?
Why?
Yeah.
Because, first of all, because global temperatures have actually risen. So as long as temperatures rise, this scare will continue. No one knows how long it will rise. No one knows really how much it will rise. But for the last 30 years or so, ever since the Rio conference, temperatures by and large have risen, sometimes less, sometimes more, but they have risen much slower than the computer models predicted. So in 1990, for instance, when the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the UN's climate body, published their first assessment report, they predicted that global warming would rise by 0.3 degrees per decade. So 3 degrees in 100 years' time. In reality, the global temperature has risen about half, two-thirds, half of the model. So it's much, much slower. No one knows why it is much slower than the models predicted. There are all sorts of theories, but the reality is that the global warming trend is much slower than the models have predicted over the last 30 years. And that's the good news. But as long as temperatures do rise, people will say, well, it will get worse, it will get worse, it will get worse. And we are in that situation where this is the biggest scare since the Middle Ages, basically. I don't think there has been a different age when people were as afraid of doomsday as they are today. But the good news is that for the time being, the warming is much, much more gradual and slow than most scientists had predicted.
Climate should remain the way it is. Has it changed in the history of our planet?
Of course it has changed. Ever since there was a planetary terrestrial climate, it has changed. What we know from studying ice cores, for instance, there have been huge changes, but the changes were much bigger during ice ages than in interglacials. We live in an interglacial between ice ages. There is a big debate in the scientific world about how much change there was, let's say, in the last 2,000 or 5,000 years. So, for instance, there are many, many pieces of evidence to suggest that in the Middle Ages, 600, 700, 1,000 years ago, we had a warm period, or during the Roman times, we had a warm period. But what we don't know for certain is how warm it was. Was it as warm as today? And was the warming as significant as today? And there is a big debate. There are people who are saying, no, the warming today is unique. It has never happened in the last 10,000 years. And if there was warming, it was only in the northern hemisphere, it wasn't in the southern hemisphere. So because the records are much poorer, if we go back, let's say, a few hundred years, there is more debate and more controversy about how much climate change there was in the past. And that's a problem, because a lot of skeptics argue that the current warming period, the modern warm period, is not unique, and it is something that happened in the past, during the Middle Ages, during the Roman times, and during the so-called climate optimum, 6,000 years ago or 7,000 years ago. But we can't say for certain how the modern warm period is different from previous warm periods.
Well, here in Brazil, if you speak to 99% of the journalists or regular people, they will say that we are facing an unparalleled challenge and that 97% of scientists agree. Is that true? Is the science settled regarding climate changing? Why do they say 97% of scientists agree with that?
If you read the small print, then what the 97% of scientists agree means is 90, 70, or the vast majority. That's not, almost all scientists agree that CO2 is a greenhouse gas, and that as we emit greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, all things being equal, it will have a warming effect. No one really questions that. The big question is, how much warming does it actually cause? That's the big question. Is it 70% of, if you take, let's say, the last 150 years, and we've seen a warming in the last 150 years of, let's say, 1 degree Celsius, okay? So how much of that 1 degree is due to natural factors and how much is due to our CO2 emissions? And of course, once you ask that question, the number of scientists agreeing drops significantly. So what most scientists, almost all scientists, agree is that greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide that we emit, that we produce, in factories, in power plants, driving cars and so on, we are emitting that. We can measure that in the atmosphere. This will have a warming effect on the global temperatures. That's where the consensus stops. Every other question, how much of it and what are the effects of it, that's where the big debate begins. And never mind, what we should do about it, or whether we should do anything about it, whether it's a bad thing. I mean, if you look at the last 150 years, which is the period where we've pumped most of the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, hasn't been such a bad time compared to, in human history. We've made huge progress. We are developing fast, not just in the West, not just in Europe, but now in all parts of the world. Food production is at record levels. There's hardly any starvation. If there is starvation, it's mainly because there's civil wars or something. But in terms of food, we are producing more food than we consume. The food is rotting in warehouses in India. And no one, 50 years ago, people were millions, tens of millions of people were starving. So if you look at the overall picture, we're actually not in such a bad state. So people would say, well, but it's getting worse, it's getting worse. It's always getting worse. That is the kind of mantra ever since humans started complaining. But in reality, for the time being, societies are coping very well with the climate. That doesn't mean that this will go on forever, because no one knows what's going to happen to our climate. But for the time being, we're doing very well. And there is no reason, at least for the time being, to think it's getting worse.
Are there more people dying of weather events today than 100 years before us, or a decade before?
That's the opposite. In fact, tomorrow is Earth Day, and we're publishing a new report on the state of extreme weather. And in that report, we point out that the number of people dying from climate-related, weather-related disasters has declined by over 90% in the last 100 years. So today, less people die from weather or climate-related disasters or hurricanes, droughts, floods, wildfires, you name it.
They tell us that we are facing more hurricanes, droughts, and it's unusual. Is it right?
Even that is not right. And the official UN data set confirms that the number of climate-related disasters has actually declined in the last 20 years, declined by about 10%. So the question then is, how can that be, given the media coverage? And of course, scares, fears, disasters sell. So we have unprecedented access to every corner of the world. If anything happens everywhere, anywhere, it will be on the news. And that gives the impression that it's getting worse. But if you actually look at the data and the trends over 20, 30 years, what you see is we're getting much less of these disasters, and we're getting much better in dealing with the disasters that still occur. So take, for instance, Bangladesh is a good example. Tropical storms in Bangladesh used to kill hundreds of thousands of people because people were living on the coast. Then a tropical storm would hit them. They didn't know that it was approaching, and it would inundate thousands of villages, and tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people in the 70s would be killed. Nowadays, we have satellite warning systems so people can see if a tropical storm approaches your coast, that you can send out warnings a couple of days in advance. People can then move to safer areas, and people are safe. So even though we still have tropical storms and hurricanes, they're not getting worse or more. We don't have more of them. We're not getting worse storms, and we're getting better at dealing with storms and droughts and floods. I mean, these things won't stop. Even if we stop emitting CO2, we will still have hurricanes and floods and droughts, because that's part of the, terrestrial
part of the planet. Yeah. Yes. Going back to the CO2, is CO2 a fertilizer? You said that we have bigger crops now. Does CO2 have something related to it?
Partly, yes. We know from NASA satellite reviews that the planet has become greener in the last 30 years. So more areas of the planet have grown green. It's a combination of less deforestation in many parts of the world, and reforestation in many parts of the world, and CO2. It's a combination. It's not entire, but of course, the increased levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has a positive effect on vegetation. We know that. And so that's part of the explanation why the planet is actually getting greener, despite all the bad news coverage and Brazil in particular has very bad news coverage when it comes to deforestation. But in actual fact, and I'm not here to talk about the Amazon at all, but globally speaking, we are making huge progress in greening the planet. Also, let's not forget that the agriculture, the industrial agriculture, by and large has a much lower footprint than small-scale agriculture, because you need, if you have very, very small farms, you need so much more land. And the industrial forms of agriculture, which are now predominant all over the world, they use better technology and therefore need less land. So that is another explanation for why the vegetation is spreading quite significantly. It in total amounts to a land area the size of the US that we've grown back vegetation in the last 30 years. Like a new continent, a new green continent. Yeah. It's a lot, it's huge. And all indications are that this is going to continue because once countries develop, they use less forests. They begin to reforest because it's an industry. You can actually earn money. And so if you compare, developed countries with developing countries, you will see that is a big difference. So once you have the luxury to look after the environment because people are well fed, the environment will do very well.
Let's come back a little bit to the Ipcc modeling. Can you say that the modeling is right? Does the Ipcc take into account the solar cycles, the clouds, for instance? There is a new study published on the GWPF website on April 6th this year by Dr. David Whitehouse related to the connection of solar activity and the weather. Do we have other models besides the Ipcc?
The climate modeling is highly contentious because the climate itself is so complex. And we know from modeling that if you fail to include all significant factors into a model, even if you fail to include one significant factor, it can completely skew the results. Now, I've already mentioned that the models are running too hot, that they are predicting too much warming compared to what we are actually observing. So the warming that we've seen is much slower than the models predict. So there seems to be something not right in the models. Solar activity and ocean cycles and cloud cover are issues that are not very well understood. So for instance, take take the cloud cover issue. Because we've seen a warming climate, the oceans have warmed a little bit. That's, the surface of the oceans warm as the temperature rises. That releases water vapor. Warmer water releases the water vapor, which goes in the atmosphere and causes clouds. So the question then is, are these clouds dampening the warming or are they amplifying the warming? And then the scientists say, yeah, some clouds will dampen the warming, but other clouds will amplify the warming. So no one has a full grasp of what clouds and cloud cover actually does to the climate models. And the same is true with the sun. We don't fully understand what solar activity may cause to the global climate. It certainly hasn't a strong direct effect because we know that solar activity goes up and down over certain periods, and these periods are not reflected in the global climate trends. However, the paper you mentioned, there seems to be a fairly strong relationship between solar cycles, so in other words, the number of sunspots, whether they are, whether a lot of them are there or whether there are few on the surface of the sun. These solar cycles, we know they last about 11 years or so, and there seems to be fairly good evidence to suggest that the so-called ENSO, the La Nina and El Nino, these Pacific Ocean cycles may actually be correlated to solar activity. That's at least what some scientists suggest, and the data looks fairly compelling. But again, it's not certain. A lot in science is not certain. For the time being, I would say that the only thing that the models have got right so far is that it has been warming and it has continued to warm. And as long as that is the case, no one will question the basic fundamental issue of the models. No one knows how long this warming will continue or at what pace, at what speed. That we don't know.
What about the Paris Agreement? Is the Paris Agreement the solution to climate change? Should we cool the planet instead of economic growth, for instance? Who profits from the agreement and who pays the price?
Well, we are now moving into the issue of climate policy and what countries are doing in the name of protecting the climate. The Paris Agreement is flawed, just as the Kyoto Protocol was flawed, in that if you want to reduce cap and then reduce CO2 emissions, you can only do it at a global level. It doesn't make any difference if Europe decarbonizes or the US decarbonizes. It doesn't make any difference if the rest of the world doesn't do the same. And the developing world rightly has pointed out that Europe and America became wealthy on the back of cheap energy, right? I mean, why is Europe wealthy and the US wealthy? Well, one of the reasons why we are wealthier than the rest of the world is because we've used a lot of cheap energy over the last 200 years. And now that we are wealthy, we are basically telling the rest of the world, you're not allowed to do what we've done. And that doesn't go down very well in the developing world. And they're saying, hold on, you've caused this primarily. Now you're telling us we are not allowed to use cheap energy and we should buy your expensive wind turbines or solar panels or whatever. So this conflict between the developed OECD countries and the developing and emerging countries on the other side is at the core of the policy conundrum, of the policy problem, and is unlikely to go away, by the way. The reality is that the developing nations cannot just ignore or give up cheap energy, because if they were to do that, there would be a revolution, there would be riots in the streets. If the Chinese were suddenly to increase their energy cost by a factor of 50 or 100%, there would be a risk of an uprising against the Communist Party. So it's, in a wealthy country like the US or in many West European countries, you can ask people to pay more for energy. And that in itself will cause problems, as you saw perhaps in France. There will, be protests if people feel that they are being hurt. But in developing countries, you can't do that because there will be a revolution. And the priority in developing countries is to raise tens of millions, hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. That's their priority. And so this discrepancy, this conflict between the rich and the developing world is at the root of the Paris Agreement, which the US now says isn't good enough. I mean, this is what the new US administration is saying. Paris isn't good enough. We need every country to do exactly what we are doing. We need net zero by 2050, and every country in the world, whether you are rich or poor, you have to do exactly what we are telling you to do. And that's not going to work.
Did it work with Germany? Germany had and the EU had a very had huge targets for that, but it didn't work that well, did it? Do we have a kind of energy poverty in the EU?
Of course.
Yeah.
Yes, we have in the EU about 50 million people in Europe officially live in energy poverty. 50 million in Europe. Okay, it's only perhaps 10%, but 10% of the population in Europe, in one of the wealthiest parts of the world, live in energy poverty, which means they often have to choose in the winter between eating or heating. And that is a very sad comment on the state of European affairs. And it is to a large extent due to very, very costly energy policies, particularly going for the most ineffective and the most expensive forms of energy, solar and wind, which are kind of, medieval forms of energy production, very inefficient, very unreliable, very expensive.
And are they green? Can you say that those kind of wind and solar energy, can we call them green?
Well, they are, let's say, if it's only CO2 emissions you are concerned with, they are certainly greener than fossil fuels. But if you think about their ecological footprint in terms of how much space you need if you deploy them, how many wind turbines, thousands of wind turbines and huge amounts of solar panel space that is required to generate as much energy as one single power plant, then it's not clear how green they are. Never mind, the impact on biodiversity and so on. So the reality is every single form of energy generation, whether it's renewables, whether it's fossil fuels, whether it's hydro, whether it's nuclear, every form of energy generation has an environmental impact. And every country has different conditions, and therefore every country has to make completely different decisions about what is the best form of energy generation for each individual country. You can't really have one fit for all. That doesn't work when it comes to energy.
And you need a huge amount of coal, for instance, to make those windmills, right? And China makes...
You don't need coal.
No?
But it is still used because of the steel.
Steel
making needs a lot of coal, that is true. And yes, you can factor that in, but that's not the main argument against wind, that you need coal to make the steel parts for the wind turbine. The main argument against wind is that it is unreliable. In other words, there's no electricity generated when the wind doesn't blow.
Or at night.
Or
at
at
night
night,
with the solar
wind,
panels.
Solar, yes. So they are unreliable, and you always need to back up. What is backup? You need basically power plants that work 24/7, and the only power plants that work 24/7 are either nuclear or fossil fuel and hydro. And most countries don't have hydro because they don't have the conditions for that. So, and the Greens are both against nuclear and fossil fuels, so they think that you can power countries entirely by solar and wind, and that, I think, is a utopian dream that will never materialize because we don't have the batteries, so you can't store. The idea was always, well, if the wind blows, we will generate so much electricity that we can store some for the periods when there is no wind, but that hasn't happened because there are no batteries big enough to store that kind of electricity.
You know that this week John Kerry went to China, and some part of the papers reported that he reached an agreement with China in relation to climate change. But then there are other reports saying that no, China is telling the US that climate change is your problem. You were the main polluters in the last century, so I'm not going to do anything. Who do you believe?
Both the US and China are very keen to be seen to be doing something about climate change. In fact, every government in the world is keen to be seen to do something about climate change. Even Donald Trump was keen to be seen to be doing, he had this kind of 1 billion tree program. Planting trees is the solution to climate change. Every politician wants to be seen to be green, and everyone wants to be the Al Gore, saving the planet and so on. But the reality is that hardly any government is actually managing the decarbonization of society. All the easy bits have been done, closing down old power plants, old factories, taking old cars off the road and so on. Now, if you want to decarbonize even more, very, very difficult, very unpopular, very expensive, and technologically very challenging. So I expect that at COP26 in Britain at the end of the year, the world will come together and will agree, just as China and the US agreed a few days ago, that we're all concerned about the climate. We will all work together. We will cooperate. I mean, that's the message we've heard for the last 30 years, ever since the climate conference in Rio. And it has had zero effect on the climate and zero effect on the CO2 emissions. CO2 emissions continue to rise relentlessly. There's no, in fact, it's expected to be the second highest year of CO2 emissions this year, because the economies of the world are recovering, and there's no sign that we are slowing CO2 emissions. And I think that explains part of the panic among the political elite, that they are realizing that despite 30 years of UN conferences on an annual basis and numerous agreements and protocols and so on, nothing really has changed.
But in the last year, we have been hearing a lot more frequently that we should be back from the time of COVID with a green new way of life, echoing the UN, the Ipcc, Davos, and many politicians, like especially Boris Johnson in the UK, or Joe Biden in the US. Boris Johnson yesterday set a highest target for 2035 or 2030.
35, yeah.
Are they trying to tie our way back to normal life, to a kind of Green New Deal, Green New way of life? Is it possible? What will be the consequences?
Look, it's easy to make these announcements and set these targets. By 2035, Boris won't be in Parliament, won't be in Downing Street. None of his ministers will be anywhere near government in 15 years' time. And who cares? The reality is, and that's, beginning to sink in. If you want to decarbonize your home in Britain, you would have to spend £25,000 at least on average to insulate your home and to rip out all your gas boiler, gas heating, to replace it by a heat pump, which is about £10,000. So altogether, £25,000 per home. I mean, even it's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. No one has that kind of money apart from perhaps the top 1%. So it's not going to happen, and that, I suspect, is going to materialize in the next few years. The realization that these targets are simply unrealistic.
But until then, the regular people will face economic disaster, probably, or
either that or a new government that is more realistic. I mean, I don't think any government will survive economic disaster. If people, are being banned from going on holiday because flying has become so expensive, or driving a car has become so expensive, or heating your home has become so expensive, I don't think any government can survive that. So who knows when these targets meet reality? Everyone realizes that it's a big problem. It's fairly unrealistic, but no one knows when is the so-called tipping point, the threshold when people are beginning to get really angry about it. No one knows. For the time being, everyone wants to, when you have these surveys, people saying, are you concerned about the climate? Yes. Are you willing to make a contribution to help save the climate? Yes. So how much are you willing to spend per month to save the planet? And we've had these surveys, people say, yeah, £10, £20, and that's it. But we're already spending £300 per year. So, people, if you ask them, are you willing to do your bit for the climate? They say, yes, of course. But if you ask them, how much can you afford to do? It's a different question.
But they are talking about a global carbon tax. What are implications to the world, or Brazil in particular? The EU is planning to impose carbon border tax on emerging countries, like Brazil, yes, for instance. Brazil has complained that it is discriminatory against the Paris Agreement. What should we do?
Of course. Simple. Tell the Europeans, fine, you put a carbon tax up, we won't buy your products anymore. Forget cars and anything you want to sell us, leave at home, because we're not going to buy any of your stuff, going to buy the Chinese stuff. You wonder how long that carbon tax lasts. 5 minutes max.
Yes, that would be good, but we have a mainstream media here that creates a panic and say, no, they are not going to buy our meat, our pork and steel and iron.
You know how many Chinese there are who like eating meat? This is partly, incidentally, this is one of the biggest problems for the West. They are driving a large part of the developing world into the hands of the Chinese by this, yes, green policies. They're making life so difficult for the developing world that the developing world has to choose between crazy green fanatics in the West and the Chinese who are opening their arms and say, come to us and we'll buy your meat and we'll buy your coffee and we'll buy, everything. Just sell it to us and we'll make deals with you. don't go for these crazy Europeans who want to punish you. That is the situation now, that developing countries,
I have dogs here too.
So, hold on a second.
No problem.
Daniel, I'm afraid I have to stop.
Oh.
Either we can continue in the next couple of days. I'm happy to do more if you want.
Yes, I do.
But I have to stop right now.
Okay.
Unfortunately.
Oh, too bad.
But if you want, I'm happy to continue.
Yes, I do want. I would like to finish with Brazil and the Amazon or something like that.
If you want, can we do it tomorrow or the day after tomorrow?
Yes, we can. You can set the date and time and we can continue.
I will email you.
Okay.
Very good to speak to you, and we'll continue.
It was great speaking to you too. Thank you.
All right.